Hey everybody, Yankee here. You know, one request I get quite often is to do a direct comparison between a Smith & Wesson revolver and a Colt revolver. Specifically, the Smith & Wesson 686 versus the Colt Python. I've often said the Smith & Wesson 686 is the best handgun on the market, period. And people wonder, do I still think that, since they know I carry a Colt Python? Well, today I thought I'd take some time and compare two very similar guns to each other. The Smith & Wesson 686 3-inch 357 and the Colt Python 3-inch Combat Elite. Now, these two are as similar as you could possibly be. They both have a 3-inch barrel. They even both have unfluted cylinders, and both of these are wearing boot grips. So let's look at them side by side, inside and out, and see where they're similar and where they differ. All right, first let's just look at the overall size of the guns, the weight of the guns. You know, when you look at them side by side here, they're very similar. There's very few differences. In fact, there's way more similarities between these guns than differences. If you look at the Smith & Wesson, the weight is 36.6 ounces. The length is 8¼ inches. The width is 1.55 inches. The overall height is around 5.8 inches. Smith & Wesson actually says 6, but I get 5.8 when I measure. And the MSRP on the gun is just over $1,000 at $1,019. When you get to the Colt Python, the weight is 38.5 ounces, which is almost 2 ounces heavier, and you'll see in a minute why it's a little heavier. The length is 8.5 inches, so it is 1/4 inch longer. That kind of accounts for that weight. And it is the same width at 1.55 inches, and it's a very similar height at 5.5 inches. There's like 2/10 of a difference in their actual overall heights. When it comes to the biggest difference, you'll see it's the MSRP. The Smith & Wesson came in at just over $1,000. The Colt comes in at just under $1,500. That's almost a 50% increase in price. So is it worth it? You know, is it actually such a good gun that it's better than the Smith & Wesson even at this price, and that's why I choose it? Or do I choose it over the Smith & Wesson for different reasons? Let's go ahead and start looking at the features of the gun inside and out and start comparing them directly so we can see where the differences in this gun actually lie. Why is the Colt more expensive, and is it actually worth it? Let's start the barrels and work our way back. If you look at the barrels on these two guns, you can see right off the bat that they're very similar, but they're different. In fact, it looks like the Colt Python just spent a lot more time designing their gun, finishing their gun. They just took more pride in what it looks like. Whereas the Smith & Wesson just looks a little plainer, a little more utilitarian. Both guns have a sizable barrel rib on them, but the Colt has that actual vent in it. That is kind of their trademark, so that's a big difference. Both guns do have a full underlug on the barrel that are very nice and give the barrel a nice heavy look. Now, the Colt barrel does look a lot thicker, but that's mainly because it has that huge sight ramp on the top. If you took that out of the picture, they're pretty much identical in dimensions. They're also rifled very similarly. Functionally, they're very similar. There's just not a lot of differences between them as far as function goes. It's mostly cosmetic. Another thing you'll notice right here is that the ejector rods are a little different. The Smith & Wesson is more simple and straight back with just a knurled end on it with a straight cut recess into the underlug for it. Whereas the one on the Colt, once again, shows a little more attention to detail. It's tapered down. It's got a double set knurl on the end. And, you know, it also has the recess cut to kind of mimic the shape of the ejector rod. So overall, just a nicer attention to detail. When you look at the barrels, they just seem nicer on the Python. Now, going back to the ejector rods here, one of the big differences between them, other than just how they look, is that the Smith & Wesson actually uses a front lockup with the ejector rod. Colt doesn't see the need for that. I personally don't see the need for that either. I've never thought that it actually does much, but Smith & Wesson uses that as part of their lockup system. Colt uses a different way to lock up the cylinder, so they don't use that. And looking at the front of the barrels, you'll see a big difference here also. Now, like I said, they're crowned very similar. The front ends have very similar shapes to them, just different variations. The Colt is more flat on the front as far as the underlug, whereas the Smith & Wesson has a little bit of a backward curve on it, but otherwise very similar. However, the Colt one just looks more finished, looks more polished, just looks better overall. So, you know, that I actually prefer between these two guns. Colt just gets me on their attention to detail and their finish. And I think they use some better mechanisms too for some of their parts, like the sights, the front sight here. If you look on the Smith & Wesson, it's pinned. If you want to change the sight on there, you got to punch that pin out. You got to get a new sight. You got to put it in there. You actually have to drill it, and then you have to put a pin back in. On the Colt, it just uses a barrel screw. All you do is unscrew that barrel screw, pop the sight out, put the new sight in, tighten the barrel screw back down. Much better mechanism there, much more user-friendly, and I really like that. I like that, being able to change front sights easily without actually having to get out the drill and risk damaging your gun. And while we're speaking of sights, the rear sights on the Colt I think are better too. I just think they're better designed, they're better built, they're sturdier, they look nicer. They don't have all those little ridges in it, so it's easier to keep it clean, but they function pretty much the same. But like I said, they just have a little bit better design and a little bit better execution. And by the way, this is a different gun showing the sight here because I have aftermarket sights on the Smith & Wesson. Now going back up to our place on the gun here, we're now to where there's actually quite a sizable difference here. If you're looking at the front crane, you can see the one on the Colt, and these are very proportional as you can tell by the stars. The one on the Colt is much thicker. That frame is just a little bit beefier, and you can really see it here. It doesn't cut under as much. It's thicker all the way down. It's just a sturdier crane. And I think that is why Colt doesn't use that front lockup. They don't feel it's needed with a crane like this one, whereas Smith & Wesson maybe feels their crane's a little small, therefore they use that front lockup. But they both work very well. And once again here, you can see the Colt finish is just superior to the Smith & Wesson finish. It just looks better. All right, let's move back to the triggers now. You can see on the Colt that the trigger looks like it's made out of the same stuff the gun is, has the same finish, etc., and it's solid. If you look at the one on the Smith & Wesson on the right, as always here, it's hollow. It's a shaped piece, and it's not the same finish as the gun. It's not stainless steel, doesn't even look like it. It's a regular steel that's been case hardened, and not a pretty case hardening either, just a very practical case hardening. Doesn't look anywhere near as nice. Once again, this is where the Colt actually really beats the Smith & Wesson in looks and just attention to detail and just putting a better part on the gun. So this is another thing that I really like about the Colt. Also on the triggers, if you look at the front of them, the Colt trigger is serrated. I like a serrated trigger. The Smith & Wesson trigger, they don't bother. They don't put that much work into it. It's just a flat face trigger. Some people might prefer that, but I prefer the serrations. All right, now if we work our way towards the back of the gun and look at the overall rear side of the body, first thing you'll notice is Colt puts their plate on this side, Smith & Wesson puts it on the other. And you'll notice a big difference in the shape here. The Colt is much more sway back. It has a more dramatic curve to it. The Smith & Wesson has less of a curve as it goes down towards the grip. The hammer is far more prominent on the Colt model because of that increased curve. And once again, the hammer is also nicer looking. It's bigger. It looks like it's the same material as a gun. Looks like it belongs there, whereas the Smith & Wesson one is smaller and is once again a case hardened piece that does not match the gun. Another thing you'll notice is the trigger guards are different shaped. The Smith & Wesson kind of tapers up on their trigger guard, and the Colt is more uniform all the way around and has recessed up into the body. So you have a different shape on both of them here. I like either one. There's more curve on the Smith & Wesson trigger usually. So this is just a preference thing. Either one of these is fine with me. I think I kind of like the looks of the Smith & Wesson one better, but I like the feel of the Colt one better. Another thing you'll notice here on the Colt, that the actual cylinder release is used as the guide for the cylinder when it's closed, and it doesn't have that little bump out that goes all the way down that holds the cylinder in place like you see on the Smith & Wesson. The Smith & Wesson uses a little formed piece of metal there that always looks bent to me, and uses that little cheap bump out there. I've never liked that. I've always thought that was cheap and a poor design, but it's something I've always overlooked because it's a great gun. But that's a big difference also. And most importantly, if you look at both guns, the Colt doesn't have that ugly eyesore of an external lock on it that the Smith & Wesson has. That right there, that feature alone is enough to make some people choose the Colt over the Smith & Wesson. I personally don't mind it all that much because I'm used to it, but I would much rather it not be there. Another thing you'll notice when you look closely at the cylinders, not only is the Colt cylinder finished better, but the Smith & Wesson cylinder is a little bit longer. It's about 1/10 of an inch longer. Not much of a difference, but it is longer. You think it'd be the other way around since the Colt is overall the longer gun, but that's not the case. The Colt cylinder is a little shorter. And you'll also notice that the little recesses that come out from the cylinder lock indents there, they're going a different direction. That's because the cylinders turn different directions. When you cock the hammer on the Smith & Wesson, it turns counterclockwise. When you cock the hammer on the Colt, it turns clockwise. Now that's not really a big deal, but it does make a difference if you're going to carry a silver bullet in your gun and you want it to be the second round in case of werewolves. Well, you're going to have to know which side to put it on, because if it turns one way, you need it on one side. If it turns the other, you need it on the other side. So that's the only time that really makes a big difference, when you want to be prepared for werewolves. Now looking at the cylinder releases, first off, the cylinder release on the Smith & Wesson is an aftermarket part. It would normally just be the little flat one on the side, but I have the Hogue on most of my guns because I like them so much better. And you'll see they look completely different on these guns. Like I said earlier, the one on the Colt is actually integral to the actual functioning of the cylinder. It actually performs a purpose other than just opening the gun. It also guides the cylinder back into place, whereas the one on the Smith & Wesson simply opens the cylinder. And they work completely different. The Colt one, you pull to the rear to release the cylinder. And on the Smith & Wesson one, you push it forward to release the cylinder. Now, this is a big difference, and this might matter to some people. I have always found that it doesn't matter to me, because when I go to release my cylinder, open it up, and reload the gun, I always palm the gun in my left hand, so I really don't notice much difference in activating that cylinder release. Either which way I gotta go, doesn't matter to me. They're very similar. However, I do kind of prefer the Colt. All right, once you get the cylinder open, you start noticing some big difference here. Not only are they completely different in the way they do their star, I like the way Colt does their star better than Smith & Wesson, but also, even though the cylinders are the same diameter, the Colt is only a 6-shot. It only holds 6 rounds of .357 Magnum. The Smith & Wesson holds 7 in the same size cylinder. Now, some people might be worried that makes the cylinder weaker. Haven't seen any evidence of that. Seems to be just fine. The only difference is you get 1 more round in the same size gun, and that might be enough right there for everybody to say, yeah, it's cheaper and you get an extra round. Smith & Wesson wins. But let's continue on and look inside the gun before we make our decision. The first thing you're probably going to notice is that Colt uses a square butt grip frame, whereas the Smith & Wesson now uses round butt grip frames. Some of the older Smith & Wessons have the square butts, but now they primarily use the round butt. So that's one big difference. You'll also notice that the hammer springs are completely different. The Colt uses a folded hammer spring, and the Smith & Wesson uses a full length one that attaches at the bottom of the grip. And it has a strain screw where you can kind of adjust the weight of the trigger as long as you don't do it too much, or you're going to end up getting light primer strikes. But these are 2 different setups. And if you look at the springs, the spring on the Smith & Wesson here does one thing. It just powers the hammer. On the Colt, you can see it does 2 things. That's why it's a folded one. It's also used to reset the trigger. If you look right here, you can see they use a hammer reset bar instead of what they use over on the Smith, which is a hammer reset slide and spring. It's a separate mechanism altogether. So a little bit of a difference there. One uses the bar that's powered by the hammer spring. The other has its own slide and spring. And that's actually probably the biggest physical difference inside these two guns. Everything else is very similar. They both have hands, you can see here. Now the hand is a little more robust on the Colt because it is actually used to help lock the cylinder in place. So it's a little bit sturdier on the Colt, but it does a little more work. And as you can see, they are on opposite sides of the guns, and that's why the cylinders turn different directions. Of course, that makes sense. You see the hammer on both. You see the double action sear, the double action hammer strut on both of them. Even though they're called different things, they do very similar jobs. You can see the stirrup for the spring. You can see all the little parts, and as you can see, most of them are very similar. Like I said, the biggest difference is using that trigger return bar versus that trigger return slide and spring. And one other difference you really can't see right here is that they also use a different safety mechanism. The Smith & Wesson uses a hammer block, which would be right here if it hadn't been removed on this gun. And the Colt uses a transfer bar, which you can't see in this picture because it's on the other side of the gun. It's behind this trigger. In fact, it mounts to the trigger in the same place the paw or the hand right here does. It just runs up the other side of the gun, and it is, like I said, a transfer bar, which is basically the opposite of what Smith & Wesson uses, which is a hammer block. So even though there are some differences in here, they're pretty similar. I just think the Colt one is a little more refined. It's simpler, but I think it's better executed. I think the Smith & Wesson just gets too complicated. There's too much stuff in here. I don't like the way they do their things. They have too many safeties. They just have too many moving parts. It just makes it, like I said, a little more complicated. And you really notice that when you cock your hammer. When you cock the hammer on the Colt versus the Smith & Wesson, it feels so much better. There's not as much stacking. There's not as much click, click, click. You don't feel like every little phase of every little thing in the gun moving. You don't even hear it. You can hear a difference when you're actually cocking the two guns. Now, when it comes to the trigger pull, there's not much difference on these two guns. The weights are very similar on both of them in both double action and single action. Where you really feel the difference is in how much smoother and more consistent and cleaner and more refined the Colt trigger actually is. Whether you're cocking back the hammer or pulling that trigger for double action, it's just a much better overall feeling, and that's what makes the difference to me. Also, another sign of it being a little bit better quality gun is something very similar. With when you open the cylinder, when you work that mechanism, you open the gun up, you actually make it move. The Smith & Wesson is just not as refined. It is more clanky, more rattly. It just is not quite as sophisticated as the Colt. The Colt is smooth. It's clean. It's quiet. It's just a machine that someone spent more time on to make it more perfect. But is it perfect enough to make it a better gun than the Smith & Wesson? It is better refined. It does have a better trigger. You know, those things matter. And that's why I like it better, because I like the trigger better. And also, I like the aesthetics of it better. I think it's a better looking gun. And I think when you have a gun that you like the looks of, you're more likely to carry it because you're proud of that gun. So I think that's a big factor when it chooses a gun. Now, I would like to have the 7th round available in the Colt, but it isn't. But I like that trigger enough that I'm willing to sacrifice that round. I like the trigger and I like the looks enough that I will accept 6 rounds over 7. And to me, it's worth the extra money. That's why I choose the Colt. But overall, when you look at all the differences and when you look at the fact that the Smith & Wesson will do everything the Colt will do, it might just be a little clickier doing it, might be a little rougher doing it, but it'll still do it. And everything about the two guns are very similar, and the Smith & Wesson gives you 1 extra round and costs way less. Well, that means in the end, when you look at both these guns, even though I prefer the Colt, the Smith & Wesson 686 Plus is still the best gun you can buy, period.